Hello and welcome to Podcast Villa. My name's Ant, and each week myself and Amy speak to different podcasters from around the world about what they're doing, how they got into what they do, and why they're so excited about podcasting. Today, my guest is a longtime friend and compatriot of mine, Jim Salveson, who has gone on to do many great things that we'll talk about a little bit. But what I find really exciting about Jim's journey is like me, we started off when really there was no podcasting. We were there just before podcasting emerged. We were both working in radio, and over the years, both of us has shifted slightly different directions. But now Jim is making more podcast and audio for on-demand devices like, I won't say the names out loud, but those little Google and Amazon devices and Apple devices you might have, making audio specifically for them, and as well as lots of podcasts, having just launched the Sports Social Podcast Network. So, Jim Salveson, thank you very much for joining us today.
Hello, Ant.
And thank you very much for giving up the time to chat to us about all the things that you do in the world of podcasting, what you find exciting about it. And let's start off really there. Because you've obviously got the choice. You still have the work, you still do a radio show, you work with devices, but with podcasting specifically, what for you is it that you find really exciting about that medium, both now and if you can remember right back at the beginning about that as a place to do audio?
I think I've always been quite excited by new technology and different ways to distribute audio. And that has been something that I've always had half an eye on throughout my career. So even in my early years as a radio producer, it was always interesting to see the way you can take your content that you're making in a radio show and push that out through other channels, be that via social media or be that via podcasting that came along. And I think that's where my podcasting journey kind of started. It was repackaging the content that we were making on the radio and finding a new audience for that online, almost as a marketing tool for the radio station. As we all know, that's a pretty lazy use of podcasting nowadays, and it's developed far beyond that. I think what excites me now is probably slightly different from a podcasting world, because although for many people it is still an emerging media, it's a buzzword, people are getting more and more engaged with it all the time. I think for the likes of us, Ant, who have been making podcasts for a decade and a half now, probably, yeah, it's it feels like it's not at the edge of technology. It feels like it's a little bit further back than that. But I think what excites me about podcasting now is the low barrier to entry, the fact that absolutely anyone with very little outlay can pick up a device, can make a podcast, and can have a voice that says something important to someone somewhere in the world and potentially find that person somewhere in the world who will listen to it and enjoy it. I think that is what I really like about podcasting, the fact that anyone can do it, and increasingly less so, but ultimately it's a pretty level playing field. When you compare it to something like television, podcasting is a hugely level playing field that John that lives next door ultimately has the same potential to get an audience as an ex-Premier League footballer working with the BBC.
So on that, what are some of the things that you've done in sort of all your experience over the last 15 years? Anything that comes to mind that you've done that you weren't possibly able to do in radio, maybe because somebody didn't believe in that as a concept, or the kind of subject matter you were wanting to talk about, there wasn't a place for it? Have you had experience of that yourself?
I think probably for me, and I really got into podcasting with a project that we worked on together on the left side, which was a football podcast. And I was made redundant from my radio job and felt like I needed some kind of creative outlay whilst I was on gardening leave. I needed something to do ultimately. So I started this football project, which enabled me to, the concept wasn't particularly revolutionary at the time, although there wasn't much else out there that did similar. It was a very short form podcast before short form podcasts were really in vogue. It was taking some of the skills that we'd learned from our time in radio and putting that into podcasting in terms of high production values, in terms of quick, punchy content instead of your 2-hour Joe Rogan monologues or whatever it is. So it was kind of using these rules we'd worked in radio and moving them into podcasting. So And what I really learned from that experience, and where this relates to your question, is that I started off that experience of making those podcasts in having self-imposed rules on myself in terms of what was and wasn't allowed. So in my head, it was strictly, there'd be no profanity. There'd be certain topics that would be off table. There'd be a structure that had to be adhered to, because this was the way things were, and was the way you made a successful podcast. And I think the journey that I spent on that show with yourself was learning that actually none of that matters. And the beauty and the perfect thing about podcasting is there are no rules, there are no limitations. You can do what you want. It doesn't matter what anybody else says is right or is wrong. It is 100% within your control. And I think that's for someone that comes from a professional audio background, where you're making radio and you're given style guides and you're given things you can and can't say, and you have to work within a certain construct. It's really refreshing to work on a medium where you don't actually have those rules. So in terms of times that I've been able to do things with podcasting that I couldn't do on radio, I think there have been those times, but I don't think that's necessarily the pertinent thing. I think the pertinent thing is remembering that you can do things in podcasting that you can't do on radio. And radio is lovely, and it's a brilliant medium. And I like, one of the things I like about it is that you have to manipulate your thoughts and ideas to fit the format. I think that's one of the fun things about it. But the fact that you have that format stripped away in podcasting, I think is absolutely brilliant. And I think that's one of the huge selling points of podcasting as a medium.
But that can be quite daunting to people that are just starting out, because I think sometimes it does help to have some rules in place in terms of, so when people, often that blank piece of paper can be the scariest thing when you say to somebody, do whatever you want. Sometimes for people that can give them writer's block, or whatever the equivalent would be in podcasting. So how would you sell that in a way to somebody that was maybe intimidated by the fact that there's no rules, I can do anything that I want?
I think, yeah, it's a bit of a catch-22 situation, isn't it? Because you need to know the rules in order to know how to break those rules. And that's kind of a tricky thing to do when you're just starting out. I guess it's a challenge because you need to have a rough idea, or you need to have a rough format to work to when you start podcasting. And to do that, you're only going to get that inspiration from consuming other podcasts and listening to other podcasts. But I think the important thing to remember in that scenario is working out what you want to do as an individual, as a podcaster, as a show, what your voice is going to be, and how you're going to do that. But it is completely up to you. And you can take inspiration from elsewhere without necessarily listening to other people's rules and regulations. And one of the things that winds me up slightly about when you see the podcast supporter group type places and the podcast forums and whatnot, in that someone will say, oh, I'm going to do this. And they'll have 22 people jumping on them and go, oh, you can't do this. That's wrong. No, that's not the way to do it. You shouldn't do this. And that shouldn't really apply to the medium in any way. It's things like, I'll take audio quality as an example, which is a bit of a bugbear of mine in two ways. One, because I'm a bit of an audiophile. I work in it professionally, and I like things to sound nice that I make. But the further I get in my podcasting career, and in fact in radio as well, I'd go by the same token, it's increasingly less important, I think. And I think if you're worrying too much about your audio, your storytelling is not strong enough. But I've never listened to a podcast where the story was brilliant, but the audio quality was crap, and turned off because the audio quality was crap. But the other way around, I've listened to thousands of podcasts where the audio was brilliant and the storytelling was crap, and I've turned off after seconds. So it's kind of working out where your priorities are, where I've completely gone off track from your original question and gone down a different avenue. But yeah, I think do what you want to do. Take inspiration from other places, listen to podcasts, work out what you like, make your hit list, work out what your voice is, work out what you're passionate about and want to talk about, and then take it from there. And it is a case of, and it's really difficult to do when you're just starting out and you have got that blank sheet of paper and you're going, what am I going to podcast about? But the first thing to do in podcasting is to podcast. is to record your voice doing something, and that recording might never see the light of day. You don't have to publish it, but getting over that fear factor, that first step of, okay, what am I actually doing? And it could be just be a voice note on your phone. I think it's really important for those people who have that kind of immediate fear, that block.
Yeah. And I think the great thing about it is how quick it is to start actually recording something and to make something and have it out there. And for example, with the project you mentioned that we worked on together on the left side, which is still available, people can go find it and have a listen. I still remember the first few conversations we had about it, and you sent over some ideas, and we started making it because it was an excuse to work together. We'd not done something for a while, and I don't think either of us realized what it would entail. And for a long time, it sort of took up all my Sundays. It took up a lot of your time away from your wife and your son. And then, but the brilliant thing about it is now,
by the way,
the great thing about it is how quickly we built up this library of shows. And you know, we recently last year we after 5 years we put it to bed. Technically on a hiatus, but I think that's it. But we racked up, was it 291 or 293 episodes, something crazy like that, and that's an incredible thing. So now, even if we'd done nothing else, whenever we have a conversation about something like this, we can say, oh yeah, not just that I want to do a podcast, but we've done it and it's there, and you can very quickly show it to somebody on their phone. Whereas previously, I think you go back not even that far, like 10 years ago, you could blag something. You could tell somebody, oh yeah, I've done this thing. And there was no way for them to check up and find out if you did it. Whereas now, not only can you say, you can actually present it to them and say, look, here's all these things. And I think it's a really great, almost like a portable resume or CV that you can carry with you to show all the stuff that you've done.
I think potentially more importantly than that, the thing you get out of podcasting is more than the podcast itself. If that makes sense. And again, if we take that show as an example on the left side, I think what I got out of that, so I went into that as a presenter and a producer. That was kind of my skill set at that point, very heavily based in music. I'd done a little bit of speech, a little bit of sport before, but ultimately I'd spent my life working in music radio. By the process of making that podcast, I developed my personal skills in terms of a writer, because I was writing these 15-minute comedy scripts on a weekly basis. I wasn't doing any of the production, so that you kind of did all of that. So, which was an interesting and freeing experience for me as an individual, kind of to step away from that side of things, which also taught me a lot about being able to let go when you're working with a team, and kind of trust and responsibility, but also the kind of, for me, again, it was a focus on sport that I'd never had before. And now I'm in this position as a head of sport for a voice podcast and media agency, which I wouldn't have been in if it hadn't been for those experiences starting back when we started making that podcast. That's just me as an individual. I think loads of people will take different things from their podcast, and it could be a fear of public speaking. It could be just something as simple as you getting over a fear, not developing a fear of public speaking, by the way. It could be something as simple as hearing your own voice back, which thousands of people are uncomfortable with, listening to their recorded voice back to themselves. And you hear podcasters saying it all the time. Getting over that fear is still a valuable thing. And the more we move into an audio-based world, with the likes of Clubhouse launching as a communication tool, with Twitter audio and all that kind of thing, being able to hear yourself back is a valuable skill. So yeah, there's it's more than just making podcasts is more about than just making the podcast. It's kind of about those transferable skills that you take away off the back of it as well.
It's really interesting the way you talk about your career and the effect that it had on your career. So Amy, that I was speaking to last time, but she started a podcast about a TV show, and which we've got experience of as well. And by the end of it, she was actually invited onto the set for 24 hours to interview anybody that she wanted, from the cast and crew, which is kind of the ultimate thing. But it's this amazing thing where they've had that idea, they've got that passion, they've gone out and created it, and it's led to this amazing sort of outcome. And I think in your case, it's the same sort of thing. You've gone into something because you had an urge, a desire, a passion you've learnt all these skills, and those skills are as valuable to your employers now as somebody else that had taken a so-called traditional route, if you will.
Yeah, and I do a lot of talks with various kind of students and whatnot about how we've got in Manchester, we've got a great big media department at Salford University, the Radio Academy, the company I work for, have close ties with them. So we talk to students quite a lot about how to get into media and how to get into radio. And probably about 10 years ago, my answer would have been, don't bother. It's like the jobs are disappearing, it's contracting, and those entry level jobs have kind of vanished. So you kind of go big or you go home almost. So the opportunity was really limited. And I think podcasting has kind of opened up a route there a little bit to be able to hone your skills and get in at a decent level. If your ambition is, and there's no reason why just because you're making podcasts, your ambition is to be a television presenter or a radio presenter. But I think it opens up those opportunities. So my advice to those people now who say, how'd you get into it? It's like, just go and do it. Just do your own thing. Make your own brand almost. And there's a couple of, in recent history, there's a couple of people who I've worked with who have taken that to the extreme. So a fellow who you might have heard on 5 Live recently called Statman Dave, who is a Manchester United expert. He does the football phone in and whatnot. And he was making podcasts with us a couple of years ago. And he was doing a bit of YouTube broadcasting, and he was developing his own brand. So I'm not taking any credit for what he's achieved there. He's done absolutely brilliantly. But we had him on the podcast at his very early stages, and he'd sort of used that to develop his sound and develop his voice. And he's gone on to work for 5 Live. And likewise, Natalie Pike, who you might have again heard on BBC. She's a broadcaster on BBC Manchester. She does some bits for 5 Live. She appears on Fighting Talk every now and again. She was a host at Manchester City's City Square, which is their halftime entertainment. And again, we brought her into the podcast, onto the radio show. She established herself as a broadcaster and did other things around that in terms of creating her brand. So again, taking no credit in that front. But these are two individuals that did their own thing. They established their own brand. They found their voices as broadcasters through podcasting, and that's been a route for them through to mainstream media. So yeah, if you're looking to do that kind of thing now, like I say, the barriers for entry are so low. You can make a YouTube channel, you can create a podcast really, really easily, and you can find your feet, because the first few episodes or the first few bits of audio you put out, no bugger's going to listen to them anyway. So that's your opportunity to do something, publish it and review it without really worrying what anyone's thinking.
Do you think the difference between a good podcast and a bad podcast, just reading between the lines of what you said, because you said equipment isn't important and almost the idea is not so important as well. It's more about just doing what you want to do almost. Is that kind of what you're saying?
I think I think both those things are important. If you can get everything right, then perfect. You should try and get everything right, but it's important not to get too hung up on those individual things as well. Like, I like an idea. I'm an ideas person, and I buzz off something that's done slightly differently. So I really like that as an individual, as a listener. The last thing the world needs is another 3 blokes sitting around a microphone taking a sideways look at the world. No one needs another podcast that does that. But that said, if that is done really well and you've got 3 brilliant storytellers involved there, that can work for me. I think it's difficult to say what's important and what makes a podcast work, because, and this is going to sound incredibly up itself, but podcasting is an art, and art is completely dependent on the person who is viewing that art as to whether it's good or bad. And the same with music to a certain extent. Just because a song is incredibly complex and written by a composer, to an individual, it doesn't necessarily make that any better than something the Cheeky Girls have churned out. It's an objective thing. And podcasting's kind of the same. For me, personally, I think it's about storytelling, and it's about engagement. I think that's the superpower that podcasting has, which is why it's such an exciting place to be at the moment in terms of sponsorship and in terms of attracting advertisers, is because podcasting can engage with a listener like no other medium can. It's such an intimate way to communicate. And because of that, that's why storytelling really works, because you can tell a story in a really intimate way and connect with someone in such a powerful way that's really difficult elsewhere. So that's the sweet spot for me. but not necessarily. I'm not saying that's necessarily the sweet spot for everyone, but for me, it's about storytelling.
I'm just thinking for the US audience that we've got here, how to explain the cheeky girls. Probably best that I don't.
Google it, but I don't think you should.
Yeah, I was going to say one hit wonders, but I'm not even sure that really was a hit that anybody wants to hear again. And yeah, we also mentioned BBC Five Live, which is a national radio station here as well. Jim, thanks very much for taking the time to come and talk to us. You've given us a lot to think about and digest. And I love the way you ended there with the storytelling. I also love that you touched across a couple of buzzwords now in terms of sponsorship and monetizing podcasts, which so many people are looking into, and it's starting to happen now. There's a lot more money going into it, which again is attracting a lot of people to the medium. Before we let you go, please tell us where we can find out more about you and listen to some of the shows that you're making or have made. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
So you can find the On the Left Side podcast somewhere in podcast world still. I think despite my insistence, it should all be deleted. Still there. I currently work for a project called Sports Social. It is a on-demand audio sports company. We create short form audio for the voice activated devices that Ant's mentioned, like Google Home and the Amazon One as well. We do that for ourselves, and we also do that for sports brands and teams and governing bodies right around the globe. Recently, if you're a podcaster, probably what you're more interested in is our project that launched a couple of weeks back called the Sports Social Podcast Network, which is a network of sport podcasts from around the world, some of the best content creators being brought into one place. So we act as a kind of hosting platform for those podcasts, distribute out to the usual channels, but use the power of the network to help those podcasts grow. And also, as you mentioned, everyone loves a bit of monetization, help them monetize their products as well. So yeah, that's where we are. If you want to find more, sport-social.co.uk.
And if you want to follow Jim on Twitter, it's at Mr_Jimbob.
Yep, very random things I tweet about. It's not all podcasts. It's mostly a bit of football, music, and occasional podcast stuff. Yeah.
All right, Jim. Thanks very much for coming along and having a chat. It's great to catch up with you, and I look forward to hearing the next project that you've got lined up, whatever that might be.
Cheers, Ant.